Mark Zuckerberg is standing behind Donald Trump at the inauguration. Sundar Pichai is there. Tim Cook is there. There's no major social media platform right now that is not beholden to the Trump administration in some way. And I think that that is a problem.
Over the past week, Silicon Valley has been in an absolute meltdown. Tech stocks plummeted on Monday after DeepSeek, a Chinese company, released multiple open source AI models that blow US competitors out of the water. And they did all of this by using less money, chips, and energy.
The company says they are on par with or better than industry-leading models in the US at a fraction of the cost.
It's been called an extinction-level event for some venture capital firms, and angry tech people are already screaming about how DeepSeek is a CCP state psyop and economic warfare aimed at making American AI unprofitable. To untangle this whole mess, I brought in Jason Kebler of 404 Media. Today, we're going to break down exactly what's going on with DeepSeek, what it says about the global tech landscape, and how a more decentralized model for the internet could ultimately free us from this billionaire-controlled hellscape. Jason, welcome to Power User.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Okay, so Jason, give me a 101 on what's going on with DeepSeek.
So essentially, a Chinese company has used older chips and less computing power to make a ChatGPT competitor that is better and faster and more efficient than ChatGPT. So essentially, the American AI industry is just freaking out.
I saw Sam Altman seem to be kind of melting down, and people were saying that this is, terrible for OpenAI. Why is this so bad for American tech companies?
So there's this big competition between US tech companies and China broadly. We talk about it with TikTok, we talk about it with all sorts of other industries. And the United States has been obsessed with having better AI than China. And one way that we've done that is with this thing called export controls, where we're not Chinese companies can't buy the latest and greatest chips that power artificial intelligence. So American tech companies thought that they had this huge leg up on China, and then suddenly DeepSeek comes out of nowhere using older chips and spending honestly a lot less money, only $5 million compared to billions and billions of dollars by US companies to make something that is better than what OpenAI has released so far.
I feel like this is really terrible news for Sam Altman. I know there was this project where they were going to spend, I think it was $500 million, something to build these data centers all over the US. And also, it seems like a nightmare for NVIDIA too, right? Which has been selling these next generation chips.
Yeah, so NVIDIA is the richest company in the world, the most valuable company in the world, behind this idea that their chips are the best and that they will be there'll be an endless demand for these chips that NVIDIA makes. And here you have this Chinese company that was able to make something really powerful for cheaper.
But wouldn't it also, if that's what they can do with the cheaper chips, wouldn't it also make NVIDIA chips also valuable, right? Because couldn't they theoretically do even more with these better chips?
Yeah, this just happened. And so I think that the way that it all shakes out is really up in the air right now. The market is freaking out because in the short term, they're why do we spend all that money on all those chips? But it's entirely possible that, American tech companies will be able to replicate what DeepSeek did and use these chips to make something even better.
I saw somebody at Facebook actually saying, this isn't necessarily just such a win for China versus the US. It's really a win for open source models versus non-open source. And obviously, OpenAI and all these other models have been very proprietary. DeepSeek is open source. And I think Facebook's Llama is also built on open source, correct?
Yeah, it is.
So I feel like this could maybe be a win for this new model of tech too, where maybe we're seeing people lean more into the open source community.
Yeah, I think so. It's DeepSeek built its model by sort of piggybacking on things that American tech companies had done and tweaked it. And now probably American tech companies or other tech companies all over the world will be able to tweak what they've done and improve upon it. And like I said, this uses way less energy and costs a lot less money. So if you're an AI booster, that's a really good thing. And if you're someone who doesn't want the oceans to boil because of artificial intelligence, that's also a good thing.
Given DeepSeek's Chinese origins, though, I mean, do you think that there are problems that are going to lie ahead? Because I saw people already tweeting out things like censorship. Maybe there's some like bias in the models. You can't ask it certain things. Also, just given the regulatory climate with the U.S. trying to force TikTok to sell itself to an American company, what role do you think the tensions between China and the U.S. government will play?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the elephant in the room here. It's like the US government has been trying to be very protectionist of American AI superiority, more or less. And because, as you mentioned, this is open source, there's no banning it. There's no banning it like you could ban TikTok theoretically because the code is already out there, the information is already out there, and it can be tweaked. And so Pandora's box is open, more or less. At the same time, I'm sure we'll see American companies and the American government, one, like fearmonger over this, and two, try to do something about it because they've been very protectionist of US companies here. What happens next? I don't know.
This seems to sort of go back to this question, which you wrote about recently, which is this sort of decentralized model of the internet. And, you know, in the early days of the internet, it was sort of framed as this utopian, decentralized place where there would be free speech and open access to information and all of that. And then in the past couple of decades, we've seen that dream sort of get crushed, where we've seen these like billionaires kind of exert more and more control over our online environments. We've seen walled gardens around social media. And you wrote this great piece sort of arguing to maybe like return back to the sort of decentralized roots of the internet and embraced a more decentralized social media ecosystem. And just sort of with these walled gardens, you're seeing so much frustration from users, right? That are like, hey, why can't I say what I want online? Why do I have to have my whole internet experience controlled by these very few companies? So do you think that there is a pathway to return to a more decentralized internet? And is maybe examples like open source breakthroughs evidence of reverting back to that sort of original promise?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you've done such great reporting on the TikTok ban, the proposed ban, and sort of what was going to happen and what happened in the aftermath. And I think for a lot of people, it's been a really like radicalizing experience, having built a huge platform, all these influencers and small business owners having built, huge audiences and having that be turned off. I don't think that we're used to that as Americans. Like, I'm very used to being able to access pretty much anything on the internet.
I don't think it's just the TikTok ban that is like leading to these sentiments, right? Because I think we've also seen, especially since the first Trump presidency, these platforms crack down on speech and access to information. I mean, I'll never forget during Omicron, one of the biggest waves of the pandemic, when you tried to search out any information online, and I wrote about this for the Washington Post, people were trying to search out local vaccine centers. All of that information had been blocked and censored in the interest of cracking down on misinformation, which sure, that's a noble goal, but I feel like, yes, we've never had a major platform like this, like ripped away from everyone, but everyone has experienced sort of like run up against the walls of these big tech platforms in one way or another, I feel like, and the way that they control our speech or access to information, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And this has been an undercurrent of social media for the last decade, where Facebook can change its rules at any moment. It can change its algorithm at any moment. It can decide to censor or delete your account at any moment. And I think that the examples you brought up are really good ones. You have Instagram and TikTok both sort of like censoring Palestinian protests and things like that. And so I think that like there's been this undercurrent of we need to design something that is less censorable and is more durable against both government censorship, but also against, big tech conglomerations and single companies owning huge swaths of the internet. And I brought up the TikTok ban primarily because it was just like this moment for me where I was like, cool, you're losing an entire audience that you may have built up. And one of the amazing things about decentralized social media, which we'll talk about how it works, is that you can't like have a single entity that just shuts it down, and you can take your followers or your readers or whatever and you can port it to another platform. So hopefully we'll create this system where users have more control over their audiences and not these big tech companies and their algorithms.
Okay, so there is this public sentiment saying, hey, we're sick of this sort of like duopoly, basically, of social media. We're sick of all these big tech companies having complete control over our online experience. So what would a decentralized social media and internet landscape look like? And do we have any examples of that today?
Yeah, so I think the goal would be to make social media more like email, where you could create an account, but then you could interact with different platforms using that same account. So like if you have a Gmail, you can email someone with a Hotmail. You don't have to stay like on Gmail only, if that makes sense.
Basically, you set up one account and then you can sort of interact on all these different platforms, but your sort of identity isn't necessarily tied to those platforms and your following isn't necessarily tied to those platforms, right?
Yeah, it's like you can download your address book at any moment and you can like go to another email service provider and take your address book with you. That's how like phones work, that's how email works, but it's not how social media works. Like you can't download your Instagram followers and port them into TikTok.
No, and I think people are realizing this now, obviously, with the TikTok ban. And also, a lot of people experience this with Vine. I mean, Vine was certainly not banned, people just stopped using it, but we lost an entire generation of content creators, right? Like, I think people are realizing how precarious it is to rely completely on these apps that control everything.
That's why I bring up TikTok, and that's sort of like why I wrote this during the TikTok ban, is because you had all of these influencers saying, when TikTok is banned, here's my Instagram and here's my YouTube. Please come follow me on these platforms. If we had decentralized social media, they could just take their followers with them. They wouldn't have to beg people like, please contact me or please follow me on this other platform. They would already have access to those followers and they could take them to another platform without like permission from that other platform, more or less.
So there's a couple examples of sort of decentralized social media that I feel like get brought up in these conversations, and that's Mastodon and Blue Sky. Both of them are basically what I would call Twitter competitors, where they're sort of text-based feeds where people are posting various short status updates. Mastodon, I believe, is totally decentralized. Blue Sky, I think, is slightly centralized. Where do these platforms fall in terms of the decentralized sort of version of social media? Are they sort of an example of what something like this could look like?
Yeah, you're totally right. So Mastodon runs on something called ActivityPub, and it's totally decentralized, which means there's like hundreds of different Mastodon servers. And when you create an account, you sign up for one of those servers. And let's say you don't like the person who's running the server, for example, you can just go on another one. And you're absolutely right that they're basically Twitter competitors at the moment, but there's also things that run on ActivityPub, which is like the underlying technology for Mastodon, that are Instagram competitors. There's, video platforms as well.
PeerTube, I think, is like an open, like like decentralized YouTube. People always want me to post on there when I post on Mastodon.
Yeah. And so like you can use the same Mastodon account and log into PeerTube or log into PixelFed, which is the Instagram competitor. And so essentially like you can have one app at some point. This doesn't really exist at the moment, but there'll be one app where you can log in and you can tweet or you can upload an Instagram post or you can upload a story and you pick and choose like where you want that to go, like which apps you want that to go, but you just upload it like one time.
Well, why would you want that?
Well, as a small business owner who's copy pasting all my tweets and all my posts across like 10 different platforms,
Fair
it's
enough,
very time
fair
consuming.
enough.
So I'm like,
That's
oh, yeah, like I just want this to go to all of them.
That actually makes a lot of sense. My issue with all these platforms is that none of them are super consumer friendly. And I think this is why a lot of people don't use them, right? Like there is a reason why we're all on YouTube and not PeerTube. And I would say one big part of that is just that it's slick, it's consumer facing. There's this sort of like it's just a much more like sort of consumable product. Do you think that any of these decentralized kind of competitors will ever be able to build a product that is as consumer friendly as one of these billionaire controlled tech platforms?
I think not in the short term, but I look at Blue Sky and I'm like, oh, cool. People are actually there and they're actually posting. And that's no slight to Mastodon. But like you said, it's kind of hard to join Mastodon. It's hard to find people to follow. It's,
But isn't that because it's decentralized and Blue Sky is not completely decentralized?
Well, I mean, we might need a centralized system like Blue Sky that like decentralizes later versus
Oh my
something
gosh.
like,
Okay.
I mean, hopefully, like, because I joined Blue Sky and I'm like, cool, like all my friends are here, all like a bunch of journalists are here. There's people posting memes and stuff. And it's like easy to join. And I think you're absolutely right. That's the biggest problem right now is these platforms are really small right now.
They also don't have built-in monetization. I feel like another big reason that people want to post on these corporate social media platforms is because you can make a living on there, especially if you're a content creator. You're not going to invest time in a platform where you can't make a living. This is why I have problems with Blue Sky, because I'm like, I don't want to invest in another app growing hundreds of thousands of followers that's ultimately going to provide no sort of monetary compensation for the amount of time and effort that I'm spending putting content into that app and ultimately benefiting the app. So are there any plans for monetization structures? I mean, I guess if they're decentralized, are these platforms even monetizing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the biggest problem right now, besides the sort of usability, is there's an obvious reason that influencers are on Instagram or YouTube or TikTok, which is they can get paid directly by the platform, or you can buy ads on the platform if you're a small business and say like, hey, come to my shop, come do it. It's like Blue Sky and Mastodon don't have ads at all. And that's partially because, you know, the type of people who use decentralized social media are largely against advertising and surveillance capitalism, like as a concept. And I think that in some cases, it's like the surveillance capitalism is a feature, not a bug for a lot of influencers because you can directly monetize it. So I think that's like the biggest thing holding this back at the moment, which is not to say like I wish Blue Sky would add tons of ads and would have like a creators program and stuff like that. But I think that's a reason why some more like mainstream and really big influencers haven't moved to these platforms yet.
I feel like also, I mean, they need cultural relevance. And I feel like this is something that a lot of tech billionaires spent a lot of money pumping into their products is to sort of market them, right? And to get celebrities on them and to sort of make sure that there's major events happening on them. Like when you think of Instagram or Twitter or Google, it's like they spend a lot of time trying to ensure that they're sort of positively seen in the culture and that this is where news or pop culture conversations happen. It doesn't seem like there's any effort to sort of replicate that in the decentralized world. So what would it take, do you think, to make one of these decentralized platforms more culturally relevant?
Yeah, I mean, it's like Blue Sky has Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and like Mark Hamill, who played Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. And it's like, I think like, no offense to either of them, but they're going to need to do a little bit better in terms of their, you know, star power on these platforms. The biggest thing to me is like the centralized social media that we have today is a problem. And this is like a potential solution. And when I say it's a problem, I'm like, Mark Zuckerberg is standing behind Donald Trump at the inauguration. Sundar Pichai is there. Tim Cook is there. Shu Chao is there. And I just think that there's no major social media platform right now that is not beholden to the Trump administration in some way. And I think that is a problem. I think that the path between what we have now and a decentralized social media system that is legitimately competitive with what we have now, there's like many, 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 many steps between where we are and where we need to get. But I guess I just like don't see another way absent, you know, like a business model shift, you know, some of these tech titans building a backbone for themselves of some sort. Like
they're not going to do that.
They're not going to do that. And so, I mean, I try not to be super doom and gloom all the time. And so I'm like, well, we have these other things, like we need to sort of invest in them in some way, which means for me, like posting on these platforms, even if there's not that many people there, and hope that like over time they get easier to use and better.
Is there anything that we could learn from sort of the right's alternative social media ecosystem in terms of how to build cultural capital and build audiences? Like, I mean, aside from the mainstream platforms, which, yeah, are now all completely right-wing and beholden to the Trump administration, I guess, in various ways, you know, the right also has this entire other ecosystem of apps like Truth Social and Rumble and whatever that support a wide range of right-wing influencers. Is there anything like that that could be built in a more decentralized way?
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting because those platforms got built because the right-wing content was being censored from Facebook
They
and
thought
Twitter.
it was not, but they thought it was.
Well, the Nazi stuff, like straight
Sure,
up
sure,
was.
Nazi stuff,
and
sure.
so they were getting banned, and then
Yeah.
they went to these other platforms where they're like, you can openly be a Nazi on these
Right.
platforms. And then the sort of like mainstream conservative stuff was not being banned, and then was just being like I don't know, like it became a talking point among conservatives.
It became a talking point, but I just like, I think of that Politico article, I think it was from 2022, of that study that came out that actually showed that right-wing content received more amplification in these feeds. And I think we've all experienced that as well. But yeah, I mean, I think that pushing that narrative of censorship allowed them to actually encourage a lot of users to go over to these alternative platforms. And maybe if we are looking at building more decentralized power structures, maybe it is worth explaining to people, hey, right? Like if you feel like you can't say free Palestine on TikTok anymore or whatever, maybe look at more decentralized options. And maybe that could be used to sort of recruit people over.
Yeah. And I think the thing that they've been successful at on Gab and Rumble and elsewhere is like starting ideas there and then filtering them up through powerful megaphones in the right-wing media ecosystem. And we're sort of starting to see that on Blue Sky, where someone will post something and then Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez will retweet it and then MSNBC will talk about it or something. And it's like,
The
that's a
worst
very,
chain.
like, that is, it's maybe that's like a very
Like
quaint.
liberal, yeah.
Right. But I think it's like that is sort of how a lot of right wing talking points, like pretty far right things, ended up filtering up to Fox News or directly to Donald Trump or these different memes and stuff like that. So I think that initially when things like Rumble and Gab happened, people like laughed at it and said like, oh, these aren't going to have any sort of influence, but they've managed to have influence even though they're not that the platforms themselves aren't that big. They've managed to have influence because the ideas filter up to powerful people on other platforms.
I feel like it's also, I mean, we're talking a lot about social media, but a lot of this stuff is also happening in the podcast world where you're seeing people now. I mean, I published this podcast to YouTube. I don't even know if it's a real podcast as much as it is just a YouTube show at this point. And then you also have Spotify now with their creators program, basically trying to replicate what YouTube has. I just saw that they're going to start giving out plaques, kind of like the YouTube awards plaques that you get when you get 100,000, 500, or a million, 10 million, etc. They're going to be giving those to Spotify video creators now. So it seems like the whole tech landscape is increasingly moving to this like walled garden model.
Yeah, I mean, podcasts have traditionally, you could use like any platform to download them, like any podcast app. Like I could go make a podcast app and tap into any RSS feed I want. I don't know how to do that, but anyone could do it. And I think what Spotify is trying to do is bring all of these, like put up these walls, because if they're able to do that, they can get like better analytics, they can deliver more targeted ads, they can monetize it better. And I don't know, that works for some of the very most powerful podcasters, but at the expense of like interoperability and having an open ecosystem and all the great things that have allowed like podcasting to flourish.
If you think about a world where we have, this is all very successful and we live in a totally decentralized social media environment. So imagine your version of the future where we do have this decentralized social media landscape. Somehow everyone moves over to Mastodon and PeerTube, and these things ultimately sort of progress into mainstream platforms that everybody uses. What effects do you think that will have on our sort of media and cultural and political landscape? Like, what would a world dominated by decentralized social media look like?
I think it would probably be even more of a free-for-all than it is now, which I don't think is maybe necessarily what we want. But at the same time, it's like our world right now is filtered through these big social platforms and their algorithms. And I do think that one of the promises of decentralized social media is like you can be in control of your own algorithm, which maybe sounds alarming, but at the same time, it's like you get to choose your own adventure a little bit more than, say, you just like log on to TikTok and you scroll and whatever the For You feed feeds you is.
But that
what
seems
you're
like it's
stuck
putting a
with.
big burden on the user in a way that nobody's going to want.
It basically just means like reverse chronological feeds again, more or
Yeah.
less, which almost every platform has gone away from.
And they go away from it because they're less engaging, right? I mean, there's this idea that people always want. They're like, oh, if Instagram would just bring back the reverse cron feed. It's like, but you guys don't really want that because it's less engaging. You spend less time on Instagram if it's that way.
It's less profitable for Instagram. I mean, not everyone wants to spend tons of time scrolling through
What do you
Instagram.
mean, Jason?
Yeah. Whereas, like, I'm just saying that, like, perhaps you could create a slightly healthier, relationship with social media if the algorithms were not reverse engineered to keep you on the platform as long as possible, I guess. Which, but I do think it would be a bit more of a free for all because people would be on whatever platforms they feel like, and there would be a lot of them. And so it would just be more like email.
Well, I don't think it would be like email. I think it would be like the days of the early web when there was just websites and web rings and there was no oversight in terms of broadly, like what you could say on different websites, right? It was all a lot more decentralized and it was a lot more on the user to sort of seek out the content that they wanted and to sort of proactively consume content, right?
Yeah, I remember thinking when I was first on the internet, the internet is endless, and it is endless. But I think that the way that we use it now, or at least the way I use it now, is I check X, I check Instagram, I check TikTok, and I check Reddit. And then I scroll for a little while and I'm like, oh, I'm done with the internet. There's nothing else going on. And I feel like I very rarely end up on random rabbit holes on the internet anymore. I'll end up on weird parts of Instagram or weird parts of Reddit, but I don't end up on weird websites like I used to in the 90s or whatever. And I think that maybe we would go back to something more like that, like you're saying,
maybe a weirder,
maybe a little more discovery.
Well, is there any one final thought that you want to say in line with that?
Yeah, I think that we've talked about a lot of things on this podcast. We started with DeepSeek, but DeepSeek itself is kind of decentralized and open source and can be modified and things like that. And so I think there's two real competing visions of the internet. There's the corporate walled garden controlled experience, and then there's the Wild West decentralized choose your own adventure experience. And these are two competing visions of what the internet could be. And I think one is controlled by a very small number of people and the other is controlled by the masses. And I want an internet that's controlled by the masses where you can kind of choose your own adventure, because I don't think that we want an internet controlled by oligarchs and their algorithms.
Totally agree. All right, that's it for this special bonus episode of Power User. If you want more, don't forget to subscribe to my tech and online culture newsletter, usermag.co. That's usermag.co. And 404 Media is also on YouTube. You can subscribe to them at 404 Media Co. I'll have a link down below in the description. See you next time.